Good afternoon. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is Matthew Kranig. I'm Deputy Director for Strategy in the Statecraft Center here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for joining us today. We're here today for the event Election Interference, Emerging Norms of Digital Statecraft. Thanks to the Howard Baker Forum for your generous support. We're hosting this event to celebrate the launch of a new issue brief defining Russian election interference and analysis of select 2014 to 2018 cyber-enabled incidents. This publication and this event are partially an outcome of a conversation the Atlantic Council held at the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, with the support also of the Howard Baker Forum, where we gathered senior government and industry leaders to discuss these asymmetric threats to our democratic processes. So as we rapidly approach the 2018 midterm elections here in the United States, I know this is a topic that's on the forefront of everyone's mind. It's a topic of vital importance, and I'm grateful to see such a good turnout to discuss this issue. The United States, of course, is no stranger to Russian election interference, but we're not alone. In the past few years, and as covered in this issue brief, there's been Russian interference in elections in Ukraine, the United Kingdom, the United States, France, and Germany. And this issue brief and our discussion today will look for some of the common threads across these cases of interference. And while many of us know that this is a problem, I think few of us have thought about the different types of election interference. We don't really have a common terminology for how to talk about these issues, and we're just beginning to think about strategies for addressing this issue. And so these are some of the things that this issue brief addresses. It helps us to develop a common taxonomy of types of election interference, a common terminology, initial strategies for addressing it, and that's what we'll discuss today too in today's panel. So this is the type of work that the Atlantic Council really excels at. We were founded during the Cold War to support the NATO alliance, and we still work to defend democracies and work with friends and partners. The Statecraft Center here at the Atlantic Council honors the legacy of General Brent Statecraft and his ethos of developing nonpartisan strategies to address the most important issues facing the United States and its allies. And the Cyber Statecraft initiative here within the Statecraft Center takes this approach to issues of cybersecurity, developing practical, innovative, and relevant solutions to challenges in cyberspace. And with any luck, we'll hear some of those solutions today. One last reminder before we begin, this event will be webcast live, and it is on the record. Please join the conversation on Twitter at @cyberstatecraft. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today's event. We have an excellent lineup. First, the author of the issue brief, Laura Galante, is founder of Galante Strategies and a senior fellow here at the Cyber Statecraft Initiative. Sean Canuck is director of Cyber, Space, and Future Conflict at IISS, International Institute for Strategic Studies. And we're delighted to have Michelle Markoff, Deputy Coordinator for Cyber Issues at the U.S. Department of State. And if you're interested in more details, their bios are available in your materials. Last but not least, our moderator and the director of our Cyber Statecraft Initiative here at the Atlantic Council, Clara Jordan. Without further ado, Clara, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. We're very fortunate today that we managed to get these three speakers on a panel together. I think it's very rare that the events gather a group of people who've thought and worked on these issues for many years. So what we're trying to do here is that we'll have Laura, Sean, and Michelle provide a couple of minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll move into the conversation. We'd like this to be a conversation with you and them and between them. So if you have any questions right after their remarks, please feel free to let me know, and we'll incorporate your thoughts into the conversation. So with that, Laura?
Thanks, Clara. So with the brief that we've issued today, we're trying to accomplish a few different things. The first is simply clarity. I have a feeling folks in this room have probably been following for the last few years the different plot lines around elections, whether it was Ukraine in 2014 or the French and German elections last year, or even Brexit itself, and tried to understand what has actually happened. Was a voting system hacked? Was a variety of different false fronts used to spread disinformation? What's happened in all of these different elections? I think in the from the 30,000 foot view, we all see these different reports that come out alleging interference, but what gets hard is really getting down to the specific actions that have occurred. So what we did with this report is we took some time to go back through 5 different case studies, some of the elections I mentioned, and also Brexit, and go back into media reporting, go back out and see what's openly available and what statements have been made by government officials, and really suss out the actions that occurred around each one of these suspected interference events. From there, we started developing some terminology to try to capture those different actions. And look, you're going to read this terminology in the brief and you'll say, I'll never use, sentiment amplification in capital letters like this. That's fine. Our point here is to start categorizing these activities so that we get some clarity and definitional use around what actually happens, instead of this kind of lumping of all cyber and information operations into one big area of interference. So that was one of our initial goals in starting to develop this, and that came out of our discussion at the Munich Security Conference, where I think a lot of people came at the idea of election interference and how to prevent it with great thoughts, but we needed a way and a framework to start to divide up and tackle this with some specificity. The second part of this issue brief gets into what have these events, what have these case studies start to show us about how states are acting, what is seemingly permissible behavior, and how are we able to understand states' evolving decision calculus as they look at responding to and taking part in all of these different actions that we mentioned in here that can be considered election interference. So I hope this is conversation generating. It's certainly not the last word on this at all, and I think it's really an evolving area. Look at the executive order that came out today, right? This is top of mind, and thinking about it requires kind of an ongoing dialogue, and one where the solutions, which I think were promised a lot in this discussion, but is definitely something that are going to evolve. There's something that take a real asymmetric approach as well. This isn't just cyber on cyber or something to that effect. We have to really think about how this is impacting us at a societal level, not just a network level. So hopefully this is a conversation starter, and I'm looking forward to talking this through with the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Laura. So I would now ask Michelle to talk a little bit about what the State Department is doing and what she's been doing and how she's been thinking about these issues over the past couple of years.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Obviously, it is serendipity because 2 hours ago, the President signed the new executive order on imposing certain sanctions in the event of foreign interference in U.S. elections. It is a topic in which we have been spending a lot of time from a variety of perspectives. One, obviously, and another example of how Russia is acting against the West to disrupt one thing or another. For me, it has to do with using the instrument of information technology to create difficulties with the information technology itself. And to this end, I'm pleased to share the stage with colleagues here, and I would particularly call out Sean, with whom I've trudged on these paths for over 20 years in dealing with Russian actions of one sort or another in the cyber area. It goes without saying that our democracy actually depends on the integrity of our elections, and whether that integrity is called into, is made suspect by the tampering with election systems or by conducting what we term malign influence operations, is very disruptive. And as people have, over the last couple of years since 2016, peeled away the onions, what it has revealed is exactly how multiplicitous the manner in which we have been interfered with. The question of what appropriate responses are to the types of interference we've suffered, where it has taken forms which include social media, creating all sorts of even movements or demonstrations propagated by Russian social media posts. This has obviously become considered a true threat to the security of the United States and the basic availability of a fair election. You know, for the purposes of this discussion and my own background, election interference in the digital space is the new medium that we're confronting with. But there are tried and true methods of election interference, including buying newspapers and doing things in the physical world. And I think it's become clear that our most dangerous adversaries are taking several approaches. I think Laura, in the issue brief, does a very good job of breaking down what type of interference activities we do contend with. And from the US government's perspective, we're concerned primarily with cyber operations that our election systems, such as voting machines and voting databases, are in fact vulnerable. And secondly, that these malign influence operations that are carried out through this range of tactics might be successful in spreading disinformation, amplifying these divisive messages for the purpose of undermining a particular election, and or the hacking of and releasing of private information that we saw with WikiLeaks and Guccifer. You know, one might think, given the recent discussions, that the goal is exclusively to affect or influence the outcome of a particular election. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. The interference efforts themselves may be agnostic as to the candidate, but they may be aimed pretty clearly at undermining the legitimacy of the election itself, so that we all walk away thinking that something was unfair or taken from us. So it may be very difficult, in fact, to tamper with a vote count in a way that would actually change the result. But the attempt to do so, the evidence of an effort to sway or call into question what you've heard about a candidate or the integrity of the election in some fashion may be sufficiently disturbing to call into question the election itself. So what do we do about it? There's no single strategy. We were talking a few minutes before this started about the notion of what we as Americans always have expected to see from our media, whatever the origin, and that was some version of what we considered the truth. So how do we deal with untruth? So there must be a combination of strategies that increases our resilience, our resistance, the resistance of the body politic and those of us who make it up to this interference by education and knowledge, and making clear to adversaries that to the extent that we can identify their efforts to disrupt, we will impose significant costs. It is clear that this is not an activity of the federal government alone. State and local governments are primarily responsible for securing election systems from cyber attacks. And while we can support them from doing so, they have been remarkably prickly about the degree to which the federal government can intervene. The diversity and complexity of our election systems, never mind issues about voting rights and voter rolls, make the election process not clearly comprehensible to all that participate. But we must make the effort to secure the infrastructure, and it will have to be, just like for any other cybersecurity activity, a continually evolving process. When it comes to the issue of influence operations, the federal government does have a key role to play in identifying and disrupting the malign actors and activities, in alerting potential victims and targets, and sharing information with state and local governments and the private sector so that they can protect themselves. But this is clearly a challenge that the private sector, civil society, and educational institutions also need to play a role in addressing. If we can demystify how foreign malign influence operations work, we can help neutralize their effects. I have to note that these techniques are nothing new for those of us that have studied Russia for decades. Concepts that they promulgated within and behind the Iron Curtain for years, what the GRU called reflexive control, have been around since early in the Soviet era. Reflexive control really describes a process of decision making whereby promulgating certain types of information leads the target to come to certain decisions without ever being clear that they were ever influenced. But the medium in this case, information technology, has made it possible for Russia to promulgate these techniques on unsuspecting Western populations in very troubling ways. So we have to begin to both identify where these are occurring and how one would impose a cost on another nation that is influencing us in this way. We have finished in the last year a major study on deterrence in cyberspace. And the novel aspects of that strategy have basically underscored that we need to be able to ensure that there are swift, appropriate, and costly consequences for states that engage in this activity that are both discriminate and proportional. And we must work with like-minded partners, international partners, to together hold malicious actors accountable for such actions. This brings me to the executive order issued today. The order puts into place preemptively a process that will assure the American public that we're going to do everything we can to prevent any interference with our election, to report to the public on anything we see between now and the election, and then to do a full assessment after the election to ensure the American people exactly what may have happened or not happened. And if we see something has happened, then this order puts in place an automatic response. It orders the Director of National Intelligence to conduct regular assessments about potential foreign interference in the election. It asks for reports by the Department of Justice and Homeland Security in the case of interference with election or campaign-related technical infrastructure. And it also describes a process whereby the Department of State and Treasury will decide on appropriate sanctions to recommend based on the seriousness of the interference and to impose on countries or other actors that have engaged. So this is a further step in our efforts. It's going to be a very long ongoing process, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. So Sean, we we promised the solutions, and we're giving you the easy task to lay out some of the solutions. But I'll let you do your 5 minutes of remarks, and we'll see where it's going to leave us then.
All right, thanks, Clara, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to be a part of this panel. And it really is a pleasure to be sitting with these two ladies. We've all dealt with this issue in public service and beyond in our careers. And here we are today discussing it again and hopefully trying to advance the ball a little bit, whether it's through the EO and our diplomatic endeavors or through commercial and think tank analysis. I had no part in writing the issue paper, so I actually want to start by applauding it for doing two things. First, it distinguishes between degrees of government involvement, and I think that's really important. And then secondly, it distinguishes between the exact nature of the activity. And I think bringing that clarity or granularity to what is actually happening in different instances is very helpful for the discussion, because we often conflate different things and the solutions to them may be very different, or at least the way we analyze them. Secondly, this isn't a new issue for the media and political circles. We've been discussing this since certainly in earnest since the US presidential election in 2016. We've had 2 years of admiring the problem, and I think we had three big takeaways. First, it's undeniable that it occurred, despite some people's claims that it didn't. Secondly, the attribution can be applied. Now then, there's a political issue that comes with that of if you can attribute, how ardently do you want to? Because then does that affect your credible deterrent if you say this country did something, yet no publicly visible action is taken against them? There may be covert or clandestine activities. There could be public activities. But that's a big issue. And then third, I think we've started to realize the strategic import, and I can gloss over this very quickly because Michelle identified it. It's ongoing activity. It's ideologically based to delegitimize Western democracies, not only in our own populaces, but also in the eyes of the Russian population that's within its own political environment, looking at its own political system. So authoritarian regimes are very happy to see dysfunctionality in Western democracies. And then last, I think there is some effectiveness to it in a strategic sense, because the more time that any country spends dealing with uncertainties in its own domestic politics, the less it can engage with adversaries or competitors on the international stage. Every 30 seconds on TV that's spent discussing election manipulation, we're not discussing chemical weapons use in Syria, we're not discussing illegitimate military activities in Crimea or Eastern Ukraine. It shifts the focus of your own polity, and in that sense it is strategically successful to some degree or another. So I hate to tell you in advance, I don't have the panacea solution. What I did promise was to lay out a few of the proposed solutions and try to highlight what may be some of the pros or cons of each of them, and I hope that'll then be fleshed out further in our discussion. So let me start with some of the cross-domain solutions that have been proposed. I've certainly heard discussions of kinetic military responses. Well, I personally think that absent dead bodies, massive physical damage, or actual manipulation of the tabulated votes, I don't think you're going to find a sovereign who's ready to try to exercise a military reprisal or countermeasure. So I think the perpetrators of these activities intentionally do them below the threshold that would trigger Article 5 of the NATO Charter or Article 51 of the UN Charter. They're designed to fall below that military threshold level. Economic sanctions, I am pleased to see sanctions that have been placed in the past and preemptive efforts to put new ones in. I simply ask the question of how effective have these economic sanctions been in various cases, whether it's against North Korean actors in the past who've committed cyber affronts, whether it's against members of the Russian leadership and their close colleagues over the years. I think there has been some impact. I don't feel that it's created the level of impact that has deterred their activity, because we still see some of this activity ongoing that is, to use your terminology, either government directed or government aligned. So I don't think it's been fully effective. We can debate how effective sanctions have been or not. Indictment and prosecution fascinates me, not because I think we're going to get extradition of individuals from countries who don't have extradition treaties or policies to do so. I find it interesting of bringing the problem home to the individuals. At the end of the day, individuals who want a successful career, whether it's in a government organization like the GRU or somewhere else, or whether it's in a private commercial hacking and consulting capacity, or in a criminal hacking capacity, they want their career to continue. Outing them publicly, delimiting their freedom of action, whether it's on the internet or actually in international travel, or even raising domestic law enforcement ire against them because they've caused a diplomatic problem through their poor tradecraft. All of these things, bring it home to the personal level, fascinate me, because if you can't hold a sovereign accountable and effectively deter it, maybe you could get the individuals doing it to not think it's such a great value proposition for themselves or for their family. That intrigues me as a strategist. I'm also challenged by the question of who should be figuring out and leading this US or Western effort to manage the information flow and declare when we're having foreign interference. Clearly we can see legislative solutions to that. We can clearly think of government regulation solutions to that. After all, telecommunications industries are regulated. We've decided not to regulate most of the activity on the internet. I could imagine a different model. I personally, even though my career was in the intelligence community, I would prefer not to see clandestine intelligence services or the intelligence community in any country really be leading activities that circumscribed political speech regarding elections. That's a place I would personally not want to go, and I presume many of you would agree with me. So where are we left? I know a lot of the tech industry has taken a close focus on that. Whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, we're starting to see acknowledgments of foreign activities on platforms or in that space, and they're being brought down or removed. I think that's a great initiative. I also know that they don't see perfectly eye to eye with the government. In the US, we had a meeting between government officials, DHS, and I believe FBI back in May, where some of the tech companies left a little disenchanted with the degree of cooperation and collaboration. Now, to be fair, the government has reciprocal concerns about information sharing with the private sector. But then what we saw in August was a tech company only meeting to discuss how they wanted to prepare for the elections. Again, I laud industry initiatives, but like Michelle, I don't think the problem is going to be solved by one camp alone. I'm also hesitant for unelected officials or a non-judiciary to get to define what shall be circumscribed as acceptable or unacceptable political speech. I can clearly see foreign government efforts promoting a specific candidate or arguing against a specific candidate to be election meddling. But what if it's foreign academics at a foreign government-funded think tank in another country who want to talk about issues like race relations or gender equality? I think you're going to have a very difficult time determining where you're going to draw those lines, and I personally am hesitant to have a company that I own no stock in or have no influence on determining what will be acceptable and unacceptable speech on the most commonly used platforms. So I'm left with a challenge of who do I want to do it and who do I want to place in this position of authority, and quite frankly, I don't have a specific solution or best answer. What it does come down to for me is the question of provenance. When you read the indictments against the Internet Research Agency and the indictments against the 12 GRU officers, the conspiracy against the United States, as it's described, has certain statutory violations. They talk about money laundering, they talk about identity theft, they talk about computer hacking, Title 18, Section 1030 under US law. They talk about the conspiratorial false registration of domain names. Okay, specific actions that were taken. But the conspiracy to defraud the election system is they do it on a conspiracy charge, Title 18, Section 371, rather than something that's actually specifically related to elections. I am thrilled that election systems have recently, about a year and a half back, been identified as critical infrastructure. When I was in office through May 2016, it wasn't even listed as one of the critical infrastructure sectors. So I think in the US we are making progress. We're trying to figure out how to deal with this, but our system itself is not perfectly designed to combat this. Like Michelle says, there is a history of sovereign efforts to influence foreign elections. We can talk about Voice of America and Radio Free Europe. We can even point out President Obama traveling to London to give a public speech while he's a sitting US president against Brexit. Okay? What do we consider acceptable and unacceptable political influence in another country? For me, it comes down to knowing who is saying it, that provenance issue, which immediately gets pitted against our desire for privacy or anonymity in the political speech arena. It's the question of misstating or misrepresenting support, sort of this fraudulent misrepresentation. And then, of course, one that I think is a little more clear-cut is actual incitement to violence that could disturb public safety. And here, when you have, promoting two competing rallies in the same place and, trying to get heated individuals face-to-face in near proximity, you're actually just creating a challenge for the police rather than trying to do legitimate political speech, if I can offer that. So I realize I'm not offering you any concrete solutions, but if we try to look within the domain itself, vote tampering, I think we know how we deal with that. And I think that would be across the line. I think you might get substantial, even kinetic responsive approval that someone undermined critical infrastructures. That's what's important about identifying this as critical infrastructure. When we come to pure influence operations and the concept of doxing, stealing information and putting it out there, the problem again becomes two of our core values are going to be pitted against each other. We want to protect our elections. We want to provide deterrence to adversaries, but we're going to fight by certain rules that we've imposed on ourselves, that we only want to release true information. If you start doxing, let's take Russian oligarchs close to the United Russia Party, for example, I imagine you're going to have a lot of US government officials and US corporate magnates getting doxed, but not necessarily with only true information. So if a sitting cabinet official comes out and says, yes, I did items 1, 2, and 3 here, and I've concealed the fact that those of concern occurred, but numbers 4 and 5 really never occurred. Trust me. This document that the Russian government or some other posted website has offered, it's only true 60 or 70%. And true, I hid that 60% from you until now, but you gotta trust me on the rest. I offer that's actually gonna be a game we lose unless we're also willing to get into the disinformation game, which to date our polities refuse to do. Again, speaking personally, I fall in that camp of I would not want to start creating that labyrinth of lies that would be affecting our own population as well. There's a genuine reason why there are legal prohibitions on places like CIA doing covert influence campaigns that would affect US population sentiments. I don't think we want to go into that space. So I think it's a conundrum that there is no certain answer to, but we have to figure out how we want to balance certain of our values that our adversaries are pitting against one another, and that requires a really adult conversation that you can't completely have your cake and eat it too. I hope those in this room are ready to start having that serious conversation with us, and I hope this issue paper pushes that discussion well beyond this meeting here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, so much to unpack. I think, when I'm hearing the conversation about solutions and the thinking behind it, I think the first thing before we can talk about solution is really how do we build our resilient societies? What do we have to do on the educational level? And maybe the first step to it is demystifying what's going on out there. So I'd like to hear maybe your all stake, starting with Michelle, as what do we as society understand about what Russia is doing, but what do we not really understand in their motivations and what they're trying to attack in our society?
Where would I start? I certainly think that when the wall fell and the Soviet Union fell in '91, we kind of showed Russia the back of the hand. That is, we declared them a failed state, and we ceased to conceive of them as a true adversary until the last several years. I happen to think that that was a mistake, that we have lost the think tankers, the academics, the practitioners who worked during the Cold War to understand their motivations, how they operated. Most of those things have not changed for any of the Russian intelligence community, the FSB, which is the successor to the KGB, and all. They're still using the same techniques. They do remember exactly how things work. On top of which, you know, this medium of information technology, which gives them an ability to project their ability to manipulate populations far beyond their normal circle of contiguous states over which they had influence for 70 years, is so alien to us that we, one, don't recognize it when we see it, and we have been, we've been for traditionally very bad at propaganda ourselves. So we, you know, it's kind of, we put down pamphlets from airplanes that say, "We are your friends." You know, we're kind of at the very tertiary level of this activity. So I've been very interested to watch that social media platforms have not only tried to take down what are fake accounts and accounts that resolve back to Russian IP addresses, and to diminish the amount of stuff coming in that can be divisive, but there have also been more and more posts coming from, I think, a variety of more legitimate sources that say, can you distinguish, you know, good information from bad information? How do you do that? I think Facebook has now put up something where, one, they can question and get an answer immediately about whether this is a factual post or not from you know, all these people that Facebook have hired. There's more and more of this going on. So I think to the extent that it continues and works to sensitize the population to what might be true and might not be true is important. I do want to say something about this notion of norms and who is more, you know, are the Russians, by being more sophisticated and clever in what they're doing to us, simply outsmarting us, or are they more evil than we are in some fashion? You know, I mean, we can point to many attempts to destabilize populations under Soviet control, the Hungarian uprising of '56. There's a whole variety of things that we can do. I mean, you know, you could argue that what started all of this is Secretary Clinton's fervent support for free speech and dissidents in Russia itself, and calling on them to make their views known, and the subsequent demonstrations that infuriated Putin as being the same type of influence and intervention in internal affairs that we are suffering now. We can also point, I think quite unfortunately, to telling the Syrian people who were going to rebel against Assad that they should stand up, and we would be, you know, we would be behind them. It didn't work in '56, and it has not worked very well in Syria, at least not to the extent that we would have liked. And so these are questions of prerogatives, national prerogatives, degree, whose ideology is better than another ideology. These are ecclesiastical questions in political science and regimes. So none of these are very clear-cut in my view.
Laura, I know you've been thinking a lot about how to build a resilient society and where the education, what's the role in education in all of this. So share with us a little bit your views on that.
Well, picking up a little bit where Michelle led us, which is this isn't a particularly innovative set of tools that are being used. between different types of sentiment amplification like propaganda and disinformation, these types of active measures we've seen for decades, right? The game changer in this, which we've all kind of said, and Sean eloquently went into this, is the media environment enabled by the technologies that we're dealing with, right? And how rapidly that's changed even in the last decade. So I think that's a starting point, and obviously has been a congressional inquiry, for how we start unwrapping this really unwieldy problem. And to me, one of the maybe biggest sins here is that we call social media, right? What we're dealing with is a collection of different companies who have incentive structures that are somewhat varied. But let's pick on Facebook, since that has been one of the key platforms here for how Russia's been able to be successful fairly recently. And when you look at Facebook, this is an advertising company, right? Their money is coming from ads, and they are beholden to their stock, to their shareholders, in order to increase their advertising revenue. That's their business model, right? And to do anything but encourage shareholder value would be a breach of what the company's directors have agreed to do, right? So you're looking at an advertising company, and we're also trying to treat them as a media company. And when you start thinking about this as an advertising paradigm, I think you start seeing some actions that might be that might feel a little bit more in line with the type of regulations, might I say, that people are more comfortable with, and not getting into the who gets to be the thought police, which Sean was sort of opening the question around. Who do you want to be the authority, right? No one really wants a company to be the authority. No one really feels comfortable with the government being the authority on this, right? But I think if we start thinking about this based on what these different platforms are actually incenting and how they are structured, then I think we can start to unwrap this problem a little bit. All right, so let's get a little more concrete. The Facebooks and Twitters of the world are driven not just by the advertising revenue, but by engagement, right? The more engaging whatever it is that pops up on your screen is, the algorithms are incented to continue to repeat that and put more engaging things in front of you, right? And questioning whether engagement in and of itself is the right measure, or one that is successful simply for business purposes, for advertising purposes, I think is the right conversation, hopefully the one that's happening, in the Valley right now. But I think that's where we can also pivot to an educational component that reaches down to the local level and where that needs to start. When you think about, I've got a kindergartner, so when you think about elementary school, right? Kids go to the library and there's no card catalogs anymore, right? But they're learning about sources of information. They're learning about fiction versus biography these are the basics, right? We need the same types of basic tools to understand what is a media outlet, right? There is a substantial difference between the New York Times and Patriot News America. I made that up, but your fake news source that gets in front of you. And saying why the New York Times, and I'm using a polarizing example for a reason, saying why the New York Times is a media organization with a, editorial board check on what they're doing, with a long-standing history and reputation that would be lost if they were putting out fake news. Putting those basic measures of what should you trust and why needs to start being translated into the elementary school level, into the local law enforcement level, needs to be getting to the first touch points where people are, and it needs to be acclimated to the technology environment that we're in. So hopefully that gets one layer down from Sean's start on pulling this onion apart on solutions. But I really do think that the delivery method, the medium that we're playing in here, and how it's touching people needs to be our starting point for how we get some level of societal resilience, back to your question, Clara, on this issue.
Can I build on that a little?
Please, yes.
I think the discussion's going in a really good direction. And let's take this issue of an advertising company, right? Even your major television broadcast companies, not your cable channels that are subscription priced, had their genuine revenue based off of advertising. Yet we found ways to have political candidates acknowledge which ads were actually from them. We have certain campaign finance laws. That's actually one of the things that the Internet Research Agency ran afoul of, if you read that indictment. But so even in an advertising-based media industry, like when we primarily had 3 large broadcast TV stations, we figured out how to deal with a little bit of that trust in the informational source there, or at least in the attribution side of it, because we required them to declare their own attribution. We also have another area, but let me preface that with, at the heart of this issue is a decision, how you're going to cast your vote, and you're collecting information that's going to influence your decision of how to take that very important action. I could think of another model where you have a decision to make and that you have a wealth of information, some of it completely useless, some of it possibly highly relevant. Investing. Okay, we have a regulatory environment where we seek to have certain standards of corporate reporting for publicly traded companies, and entities know that a government agency is holding those companies accountable for the information that they put out in public filings. We leave it to very sophisticated individuals, high net worth individuals or institutional investment firms, to be big boys and big girls and responsible for their own decisions. They can actually engage in other kind of investments that a small stock purchaser can't, things that don't have full reporting prospecti and registrations. So we've thought about this regarding other important decisions, how to protect the little person. And if a person comes up to you and says, I invested my entire life savings in a company X because I read on the internet that it was going to be really good, you'd kind of say, what a fool. Well, if you're casting your vote, your most important action in a democracy based on, I saw it on the internet, and then if I ask you, where'd you see on the internet? I don't know. It had a really cute avatar next to the social media post. Okay? Are you going to invest your pension savings based on that same avatar suggestion if you have no idea where it's from, if it's some robot coming out of country X, that's telling you this? So we've dealt with the judge information for an important decision problem before. I think that's a part of our resiliency or our education campaign could stand a little bit to learn from how we treat our capital markets. We don't think of democracy that way, but at the core, it's the same problem. And you go back to 1933 and 1934, that's how we decided how we wanted to treat that other problem when we passed the Securities Exchange Acts.
So, Michelle, why do you think we don't think about it the same way? What makes us so unsuspecting of this information? Why don't we really see it there where we see it in other parts of our lives?
We are a very gullible population. It's true. We have been used to, I think I said this earlier, seeing things from certain sources, New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, all of these, and presuming that while you've always been admonished to not believe everything you read, that you nonetheless take basic facts out of this and derive your own conclusions from that. I think that has changed in the last 2 years with the repeated admonition of fake news and journalism being the enemy of the people, which I think has confused the issue somewhat substantially. Because if you take what Sean just said, don't make your investments based on some splash you see on the internet or on Facebook. The question then is, on what basis do I make that decision? Mm-hmm. Do you go see the candidate? Do you believe their literature? What is now believable? And I think that has been brought into question a little bit. I want to go back to another thing about what should the government do about this? Well, let me tell you that there was a whole flurry of activity on election interference which said what speech should not be permitted. What should we not? What should we say to? Now, I want to say this in the context of the fact that the United States, with its Constitution, is the most universally permissive environment. The First Amendment allows you, except to say almost anything except to cry wolf or cry fire in a theater, things like that. And we are unlike every other nation, which in fact, on a spectrum of things, has hate speech that is not permitted. France doesn't allow Nazi speech or Nazi eBay items, which is a form of speech. Germany the same. Anyway, we are way on one side. So other states are used to actively legislating in more or less minute pieces some of that speech. The question then came, what should we tell? How should we regulate? What should the social media companies be able to do? And I mean, even in the State Department, people were saying, what do we say about this? And I said, you have to back off, because if we start on what I truly believe is a slippery slope, we will find ourselves with the Russians and the Chinese arguing that sovereignty trumps international law and all of the international instruments which give freedom of information. And by doing so, we will have given them the tools to diminish the speech of dissidents, of journalists, of everything else. So it puts us in a terrible conundrum. So I come to the conclusion that giving people the tools to discriminate between what is untrue, what is true, how to find factual answers from trusted sources that are neither governmental nor based on advertising revenue and things, ends up being the process. But it is slow. It will not universally hit all Americans well, so there has to be these differing strategies where you incentivize the private sector to remove things that are not true, give them people the tools to discriminate, and then for everything try to show as much fact checking as possible.
Laura, did you have something to add before? And then after that, I'll go to the audience to see if there are any questions.
To add to a point that I think we've brought up a few times but not highlighted, exposure really has worked here. Exposing what a fake ad looked like, exposing what the fake rally was that real Americans showed up at that was planned in St. Petersburg, right? Exposing how the Chinese PLA stole intellectual property for years. These things have given people a touch point where they could visually see, literally see things and realize this wasn't what I thought it was and what was in front of me. And it's really easy to kind of think this is not a scalable problem. Awareness is not a scalable problem, right? But I've been encouraged from examples in this space, in cybersecurity analysis, where exposing the actors and the way and the tactics that were used by these actors against targets, how large the effect has been across society, not just on public awareness, but even in informing policy. And I think what we have to balance the need for exposing bad things that happen and the people behind them. What we have to balance with that is there are fewer people in organizations and commercially driven companies too, and governments who are capable of exposing bad actors credibly. And I think for the most part, the people who have had that vantage point, who have had that visibility, have done a good job at showing their work. What's behind it? What are the forensics behind a hacking group, and why do we think it's state-sponsored or what have you? But the onus needs to be reinforced and the duty that people who have that visibility have to expose actors responsibly is one that I think we don't talk about a whole lot in the information security community, but it's an issue that's really easy. It can have massive public benefit, and it can really smack our efforts down and put us into a bad spot as well. So
I mean, on that exposure, it's not a perfect example, but I think about everything that happened around the Chinese commercial espionage, where it came from, the exposure, but then in all the diplomatic meetings with Chinese officials, that was brought up as a no, like we don't do that. And so over the years, that's been talked about, brought up in all the meetings, and it really pushed a certain norm of behavior to the forefront. I'm actually wondering, why can't we do that with these actions? Why can't we draw a line where it comes to interference and bring this up in diplomatic meetings?
Well, I would certainly argue that that's not the way the IP no theft norm was promulgated. And I would simply say, while each adversary is different, the way that particular norm came about was not so much that we repeated it so much, was that there was a certain set of circumstances when she was here that came to a head. That was one of them. Another one was at the time the accepting the applicability of international law to cyberspace. They were between a rock and a hard place. And frankly, as an adversary that's often susceptible to naming and shaming, they were confronted with the possibility that they would not, that on the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post the next day, they would be called out as not being willing to accept these things, and there was pressure against it. So they found that from that particular norm, they got a lot of useful, let's say, good press and propaganda, as they did from what was the 2013 Group of Governmental Experts report on this stuff. So I think there's a lot more circumstantial reasons why, in that particular instant, they would be willing to say those things, because they haven't lived up to either over time. They have disavowed the applicability of international law and tried to walk that back ever since. And one could contend that the lull in their IP theft activity has either been buried or they've used different techniques to get the same information. So,
Sean, anything to add to this?
I would concur with Michelle's assessment. I think there were Chinese cost-benefit analysis changed at different points on what was best for them, including both politics and economics. And I'd even offer that a lot of developed societies who used to do IP theft as a matter of national strategy may not be doing it later on. So as societies develop, they tend to seek an intellectual property legal regime that protects their interests, rather than one that is incredibly permissive for stealing. I can go back to 18th century US, and we used to steal a lot of things from England and Germany.
And they have changed to actually beginning to buy the companies that, in fact, are originating the technology that they'd like, and they're rich enough to do that.
Look at Chinese patent law and procedures. It's a blossoming industry because they're worried about infringements on their technological developments today.
But you don't think that the exposure, the widespread exposure, particularly in 2013, of the hacking and intellectual property theft at companies didn't add to the pressure that then created
naming
the
and
norm?
shaming writ large. There was a lot of stuff that was going on where we named and shamed them. But the fact that she was one in California, having dinner with President Obama, had a lot to do with it at that particular time.
I can say this again. I have nothing to do with any Mandiant or FIRE report that's ever gone out. You work for that. I will say that I think the 2013 report had more to do, the naming and shaming, with the ultimate decision to change their policy or to announce a decision to change their policy, than anything that happened during 2015 leading up to September 2015. I think going back to that 2013 time period is probably more useful analytically.
Okay, let me see if there are any questions from the audience, please. Gentleman there.
Was today's EO good? I guess just go down the line.
Michelle gets to start.
Is it
yeah,
good?
We should start here.
So with respect to cyber disruptions, we went through a period of several years where, whether it was the Sony hack, the OPM hack, or other things, where the question of what is appropriate and proportionate to do about it was the question of the day. And Sean alluded to it. We were talking about what has happened in the last 6 or 7 years with the recent increase in intensity and frequency of cyber disruptions below the threshold of the use of force. So we are in peacetime. Yet what we are encountering, many thousands of times a day in peacetime are, whether it's the theft from Bank of Bangladesh or whatever it is. The question is, who did it? Who authorized it? Who is responsible? And what are proportionate responses? It was those questions, the question of attribution, which the way we have been doing it is fingernail pulling, and what to do about it, what are appropriate consequences for that behavior, emerged as two singular questions which were the catalyst for this cyber deterrence strategy that I talked about. My conclusion was that what we had always threatened as our declaratory policy was that the president reserves to himself the right to use any instrument of national policy in response to a cyber threat or incident was meaningless, because the things that we were talking about were likely kinetic responses or strategic nuclear deterrence, or things which really are not appropriate for this. Whether it's international law or our own policy, we're not going to use kinetic weapons when there's been no blood spilt and no huge consequential disruption in American life. So the question became, what do we need to do to have these responses? And this cyber deterrence strategy says we have to solve the attribution problem for a peacetime where by international law forcible responses are not acceptable. That is, you can't go in with guns and shoot somebody for this. So you have to come up with a swifter way of doing attribution and a set of instruments of national power that fit the crime, as it were. And that's what we are working on. For example, we have used a standard of attribution that we would use if somebody had put a missile on an American asset. It's an ecclesiastical type of standard for attribution. One that is not difficult when you're talking about a kinetic weapon. When you have early warning, you can see it coming and you know its trajectory, and you can easily tell where it came from. That is not always the case, and our standard was even higher. Who pushed the button and who told them to push the button? So 3.5 years later, in many cases, we cannot tell the president with high confidence exactly that, especially who told them to push the button. And so that led, in my view, personal view, to a form of paralysis. We didn't have the tools, and we didn't have a standard of attribution that in peacetime is appropriate. So what we've been looking for is a standard of attribution that is telling, that says, we can tell that this came from that sovereign state. Now that's not enough to go say we're going to go retaliate, but what it is enough to do is to say you can go make a diplomatic démarche saying we saw this emanating from your territory, and can you either stop it or help us stop it? And being able to ask a state that is predicated on one of these norms that we established in the context of this UN group of governmental experts that said you should work with a victim of something emanating from your territory. And so we're setting up a process or a mechanism where if we see something, we're going to say something. And depending upon the response of that sovereign state, they have basically 3 responses. Oh, thank you for telling us. We'll make sure it stops, whether or not they're responsible or not. Or if it's a less developed country, they may say, thank you very much. Can you help us because we don't have the capacity to do something? Or they can give us the finger, in which case we go down another decision tree, right? Which is what Russia does. We don't do these things. We're not guilty or culpable. We never do this. Not the Skripal attack, not anything. Not Petya, not anything. And when they tell you that and you have some confidence that in fact this is Russian statecraft, this is not a spoof, this is not something else, then you can huddle and decide what is an appropriate response. Maybe you freeze an oligarch's bank account. Maybe you publish another set of the Panama Papers. Maybe you do something where you're not breaking any crockery, where the punishment fits the crime, where you're imposing consequences that are pretty immediate and pretty painful and not likely to be escalatory. I'll stop there.
Jishan, Laura, do you have anything to add on that?
I'll be really quick and so we can get more questions. Number one, I'm no longer in government, so I did not see or work on an advanced copy, and I have not read the full text. But my general belief on what it's going to contain when it's fully available is that it will be a good thing. I think your question was, is it good? I think it's going to be good. I don't know that it'll be a complete solution, so I think it's a step in the right direction. I doubt it will completely change the incentive cost-benefit analysis on the other sides in all cases, but I think it's probably certainly a step in the right direction and good to have this as an active
imposing consequences, right?
I love that you asked a normative question because very rarely does someone do that, so I totally applaud you for that. I will say this though. I think the July Helsinki meeting between Trump and Putin has a visual effect that is searing and long-lasting, and no matter how much this EO cleans up in terms of process, intergovernmental ability to attribute more quickly, frameworks, what have you. In this case, I think those words in Helsinki probably speak louder than executive action in this case.
To the Russians or to
the Russians?
To the Russians.
And others.
Mm-hmm. And from what's been reported, you can kind of see that the EO is trying to answer the criticism of there not being enough tools to respond in a timely manner, which has been a lot of criticism of deterrence policies and other issues in US policy. So I think that's what it's attempting to do, which is definitely a welcome step.
But I would argue with Laura. I would say what was designed to counter the visuals of Helsinki is the automaticity of the sanctions being imposed. So once we have some indication per the EO itself of what are the hurdles that have to be crossed, then there's no intermediary decision process. It is left to Treasury, State, and others below the level of the executive to do that.
Please. Can you get a mic?
It wasn't an accident.
Hi, Sean Lingus with Cyberscoop. Deputy Coordinator Markov, just to push back a little bit on that automaticity point. I think John Bolton said today that it was designed to allow, quote, broad discretion for the president to impose sanctions. I know there's an automatic nature of the mechanism for sanctioning, but at the same time, I think it's built to allow broad discretion. So how does that, the point you just made about sort of devolving to the other agencies, how does that fit with that
Well,
directive?
I think that there was a Q&A with Bolton and DNI Coates that was published an hour or so ago, and what I understood it was that the DNI would also be able to provide a lot of facts. I think those facts will be instrumental. All policy is going to be discretionary, but I applaud the attempt to make it harder to evade, to let something just fall away and not be countered, especially if the intelligence community comes up with an assessment that something happened and somebody did it. There's no foolproof. The president can always decide, no, you're absolutely right. But this is designed to have these assessments come up from the bottom and be presented with the notion that there should, in fact, be a consequence to bad behavior. I still think it's a step in the right direction.
Kenneth?
So if you could go back in time and advise President Obama on what Obama should have done more than he did, perhaps. I know he told Putin to knock it off, but is there anything, if you go back in time, that he could have or should have done? What would you advise the president?
Let's start with Laura.
Well, Sean's ready. Go.
Okay, Sean's ready.
I was saying, Kenneth, all 3 of us used to advise that administration. I'll speak for myself, and from day one when I entered office as the National Intelligence Officer for Cyber Issues, I argued for a much closer focus on Russian cyber operations rather than only focusing on Chinese IP theft. I think we weren't focused on that threat, and I think that while some analysts in the community understood the nature of influence operations and what information communication technologies meant for it, I don't think that was fully grasped at some of the political and legislative levels. Not to criticize and say everyone in those roles was wrong. I'm just going to say they were focused on other exigencies at a time when some of the intelligence analysts and diplomats were saying, you're missing another receiver downfield that you really need to be covering better. So I laud the analysis that came out later, like the ODNI report from January 2017. I would have loved to have seen detailed reports earlier that were getting a lot more attention. There were things being done inside the Obama administration, but the focus was not on Russia.
Laura?
I'd second that. I mean, in the times were different, right? It's really easy to look back with hindsight on this. At the same time, we were all looking at Russian issue, well, at least I was looking at Russian issues back in 2008, and long before that was Sean and Michelle. And I think the hard part that we had, or at least that I felt we had communicating this, and the gravity and the changing nature of the threat was partially because it sounded and it feels and it is psychological. And I remember being at briefings in the Pentagon when we would talk about how the Russians were approaching this very differently than how the US was approaching it, how they were thinking about this in much broader terms. And at the end of the briefing, the question would be, well, when's something going to blow up? Like when will something happen? When will this look like something where DoD can take an action, right? And in a way, that's how the system's built. That's the right question. And on the other side, that fundamentally underscores, how little capacity we had to deal with a threat that looked so different because of the technology environment.
And just so it's not, here are some people saying I told you so in retrospect, you can go back to the Worldwide Threat Assessment from 2015, and on the very first couple pages, you'll see highlighting the importance of integrity of information as something that the combined intelligence community, state INR, DIA, CIA, all came forward and said, this is something that is of paramount importance in 2015. beginning of the year.
I'm going to be a little bit of a temporal of this. Kenneth, depending upon when you are talking about when something should, if you're talking about 2016 or any of the other things, remember things were unfolding in bits and pieces. And remember the history of our dealing with Russians on this, at least diplomatically, had been the Russians seeming to be the demandeurs to diminish the threat, to diminish capabilities. And we had always interpreted kind of that process from them as being one where they viewed themselves as the lesser capable state in this area, and that they wanted to do what they'd always done in arms control, which is tie our hands and all of that. And the other thing I would say is that the emergence of states, militaries as truly weaponizing this was still kind of developing and eking itself out. It certainly was not evident to me, and I wasn't in the intelligence community, but I certainly, see this stuff. Well, but I get a briefing once a week that takes 2.5 hours. So if it was there, the full scope of the various trajectories of Russian activity were certainly not evident to me until after. So this fast process, and in 2013, I negotiated a bilateral confidence measures agreement designed to prevent conflict in cyberspace with the Russians. It was just not, obvious exactly what was all coming out at any particular time. There were little bits and pieces. And when we were getting these other cyber disruptions from the Chinese and others, they kind of began to come faster and hotter and heavier, all in a small amount of time. It was just not obvious. And I would also say, which we're trying to address, there was no standard by which a president, when he was presented with information about a cyber attack, could distinguish between, you could distinguish between whether it was espionage or a disruption, but you couldn't always distinguish on the intent, and there was no standard for saying, I'm going to respond to this because this reaches a threshold of national security concern. But I'm not going to respond to this because this is traditional espionage and we all do it. So there was a lot of, if you remember the Sony event, I mean, their heads blew up when this happened, when we all were looking at each other and saying, these are just the movies. It's okay, I mean, we made this into, a national security thing, but, OPM, we all lost our data. Not so much. It was espionage, or the Chinese said it was cybercrime. So the question is, and the question we've asked ourselves in this administration, especially in the context of cyber deterrence, what should we respond to, and with what instruments, and what is appropriate? Now, I mean, Sean, I would ask you a question. Do you find that the lack of distinguishability between traditional espionage in cyberspace and active disruption creates a murky, blurry line about what should be responded to, and will continue to do so?
Absolutely, and that murkiness is exploited by everyone playing in that space. And I'm going to stress the word everyone.
All right, there's questions in the third, fourth, and fifth line. We'll take the 3 questions and then we'll wrap up with answers to those 3 questions.
Okay. All right, Elias Roll with the Foreign Policy Magazine. Want to follow up with you just before we run off.
I don't think that's working. I can't hear you.
Question for you, Deputy Coordinator Markoff, Elias Grohl with Foreign Policy Magazine. You mentioned an intriguing possibility in terms of what an American response to a Russian or otherwise, or from another country, type of cyber attack. Said maybe you go down the road of publishing another set of Panama Papers. That's taking the U.S. down the road of disinformation and kind of Russian-style active measures, if you will.
How is that disinformation?
Doxing.
Okay, let's call it doxing. Excuse me. That's taking the U.S. down a road of doxing, of publishing illicitly obtained material that the U.S. has historically been unwilling to do, or maybe it hasn't. I'm curious if.
No. So.
I'm curious. I mean, is the Trump administration going to be pursuing a more aggressive approach in terms of publishing material of that nature?
The answer is I have no idea. What I was using that as an exemplar of being able to trying to find consequences below the threshold of use of force that might fit a crime that would be tailored to the sensitivities of a particular adversary. That's all I'm suggesting. What we are trying to do with the deterrence strategy is to try to think outside the box. If you believe, as some of us do, that sanctions have limited utility as an immediate deterrent, the question is, what other strategies might one use? One of the examples again, is China is very susceptible to naming and shaming or public stuff. Russia couldn't care less. They really don't care less. And so the question is, how do you develop a box of consequences for one vis-a-vis the other? What hits a nerve?
So let me rephrase the question then. Do you think that publishing private financial information obtained by the U.S. government is something that should be a possible option for the government to use in terms of a response?
Well, one, I'm not equipped to make such a decision because I'm not a lawyer, for one. But I was using that as an exemplar of things that one might do that might hit a nerve with a particular adversary. So don't take the example as something that I was proposing that the U.S. government was considering.
So before we go to the next question, maybe just a quick round of what do you think would really hit Russia hard? What do you think they care about in a way Chinese care about naming and shaming that would be?
Well, I mean, things that we have seen are things that affect Putin's political support. And whether that is freezing the debt of oligarchs or slow-rolling financial settlement of debt from oligarchs that might be sanctioned, so that his support is diminished because more and more they're being targeted. We have seen that some of that type of activity has had some effect. So I think trying to get them in their pocketbook is probably quite effective.
Sean, what do you think? Really?
Not dodging the question, I mean this analytically, look at what they themselves show you they care about. Mm-hmm. There have been a series of Russian court cases that have issued injunctions against certain information about close compatriots of Putin, forcing it to be removed from the internet or other media sources, or media sources being punished for having published it before it was removed. So I think they tell you what they care about.
I think energy markets are the other thing that doesn't get talked about enough. I mean, Putin's ability to, the money in Russia, the economy is based on energy. And Look at Nord Stream 2. Look at some of the energy deals that are out there. I think that's a huge pocketbook issue and security issue. And then another example back to Russia itself that has had massive and provoked the last protests, massive interest, was exposing the estates in France, I think, of some of these oligarchs. The YouTube videos exposing what these huge palatial, estates looked like of people and where they're putting their money outside of Russia is very powerful.
Yeah, so we'll just take the last question before we wrap up.
So here is a European question. I'm from Switzerland, and recently on a report for The Guardian, I went to Iceland, of all things, and because there was the voter button, the Facebook voter button, and some people in Iceland were really concerned because that was not an announced action that Facebook would set this up. It just seemed to pop up on some accounts. And I'm sure you have heard about Facebook's voter button.
No.
Have you ever heard about it? So it's that little tool that signals you, that you can vote, and where you can push on the button and say, yes, I voted. And there's a study from 2012. There are actually a couple of studies that have proven this button to be effective and actually bringing people to the ballots. And so the Icelandic people that I spoke to, even in government, were totally unsure whether this is really a case of foreign influence. Because if you look at it from an Icelandic perspective, that is a company from the US, closely working with US government officials even, and the US have a strategic interest in Iceland. And the reporting and researching more, I found that the button was actually being used during the Brexit referendum, during the Scottish referendum, during a referendum in Ireland, and all across Europe. And it has an effect. And so what do you think about this? Is this a case of foreign influence? How would you define it? I'm unsure myself. Thank you.
So who would like to take this? I mean,
I don't know anything about it.
I will just say from your description, sir, it sounds like it was an opt-in by users of a commercial product. And I think that's very different than externally pushed in information if it's those voters themselves from the Icelandic jurisdiction or anyone else saying that they voted.
Not an opt-in option. So some people just got it on their Facebook feed, and some others wouldn't. And it was unclear why. And I asked Facebook about this.
But the clicking action is done by the user, correct?
No, there's an incentive to go voting. So on your election day, there's a button in your newsfeed that says, hey, today is election day. And that button has been proven to be effective. So it brings people, it reminds them that they should go and vote. And they can also signal this to others, which has an additional effect. So I don't know, is this kind of a foreign interference, or is this just...
Are they trying to tell them which way to vote? Did they take, was
no.
it part of a poll?
No, it's just an information, but you wouldn't know who got to see that button. The company does not, disclose statistics whether it's been evenly distributed to all Icelandic people, and they don't disclose information about this. They just say we send it to everybody, but they wouldn't give any proof for that. I mean, I doubt that Facebook has an interest in changing election outcomes in Iceland, but still, if you think Telegram from Russia was like a widely used network in the US, okay, everybody would use it, which is the case for Facebook in Iceland, okay? And Telegram sends out a voter reminder to people, and some see it and some others wouldn't. Would you see this as a case of interference in US, elections? Would you see this as kind of a mingling? Because this is corporate based?
Well, I mean, this is such a particular case that it's really hard to discuss it, and I don't think we've seen. I mean, what what it is and where it goes. So I would welcome you to continue this discussion over a glass of wine after the event. Join me in thanking the panelists for joining us today, and please feel free to stick around and continue the conversation.